For those of you who've been keeping up, we're in the middle of our Easter season, the 7 weeks from Easter Sunday until Pentecost. And we're looking at what happened after Jesus died. We're looking at his resurrection appearances. And we're looking at the people around him and their reactions as they were thinking about or getting prepared to form the first Christian church, whether they knew it or not. The first Sunday after Easter, we looked at Mary Magdalene, who found Jesus in a tomb and mistook him for a gardener. She tried to grab hold of him when she realized who he was, which was a reminder for us to ask the question, what do we need to let go of? Then the second Sunday after Easter, we looked at doubting Thomas, who missed Jesus' first appearance to the disciples, and he needed to see to believe. We talked about the importance of your own questions and your doubts, and how those are the foundation for a strong faith, just like prayer and community that I discussed with the children this morning. The question we asked is, what's it going to take for me to believe? And I know that's a big question in a lot of some of your lives. Last week, we talked about redefining Mother's Day. We realized that loving and caring for ourselves and for others is what makes community. The vibrancy of young people is crucial to the life of a church, and we all need to give and receive support on our own journeys. We're building blocks, building up to Pentecost, to the first celebration and birth of the church. So this week, we have Jesus' third resurrection appearance. We find Peter and the fishermen at the Sea of Tiberias, which is also the Sea of Galilee. John used the name Tiberias, which was the Roman name for this, trying to be politically correct. But it's not a sea very often known by this name. So I just want you to know where we are. And we meet Jesus on a beach, cooking breakfast. I love this image. I love the image of Jesus providing for the needs of the disciples. But the question that he's asking them today, and us also, is, are we ready? Are we ready to leave our past behind and push forward into the creation of community? This passage begins a little strangely. The first few words are, after these things. Now, these things in the Gospel of John are those things that I just spoke about. Mary Magdalene, doubting Thomas, the resurrection appearances. These things are Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, his death, and his resurrection. Now, a lot of people read this passage and they argue about this time in the Bible. Was Jesus bodily resurrected? Or was it a physical resurrection? Was it a ghost or a spirit resurrection? And theologians can wrap ourselves up in lots of questions. But I assure you, my take on this is that it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if you need a Jesus in a physical form after his resurrection, then you can have him. He offered Thomas to reach out and feel the wounds in his side. If you need a spiritual Jesus, a disembodied Jesus, then he's yours. In this story, Jesus comes to each of us just in the way that we need him. And why are these guys in Galilee? After the resurrection, they were cowering in an upper room when Mary came in to tell them the good news of Jesus' resurrection. Well, in Matthew 28, verses 10 and 16, we read, "Then Jesus said to them, 'Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me.' Then the 11 disciples went away into Galilee to the mountain which Jesus had appointed for them." So they were told to wait for Jesus, and they listened. They went where they were commanded, but they didn't necessarily enjoy waiting. Here we find Simon Peter again, the leader of the pack, the one I told you is my favorite because he often jumps out and opens his mouth and does something and puts his foot in his mouth and is wrong and has to apologize and get corrected. So here we find Simon Peter at Galilee jumping out saying, I'm not just going to sit around here and do nothing. I'm going fishing. We don't know if Peter was hungry. We don't know how long they had been waiting in Galilee. What we do know is that before he had joined Jesus, Peter was a commercial fisherman. This was his livelihood. This was his comfort zone. He knew how to fish. And when times are chaotic or dark or confusing, sometimes we just revert back to what we know best, don't we? Sometimes we lean into our own experiences and our own wisdom instead of sitting with the darkness Instead of waiting for God's timing, sometimes we jump out and try to take things into our own hands. And sometimes others follow us. All of the disciples agreed with Peter. This sounds like a great idea. So a group of commercial fishermen gets in a boat on a lake that's filled with fish in the middle of the night, which is the best time to catch fish. And they stay up all night fishing. And they catch nothing. Isn't that strange? I mean, you would think these guys are professionals. They ought to know what they're doing. There should have been a lot of fish in those nets by morning. But I think that Jesus had something else that he needed to teach the disciples in this moment. He needed them to understand that their careers as fishermen were over. When he first called Simon in Luke chapter 5, verse 10, he said to Simon, "Do not be afraid, for now you will be catching people." But what does Simon do with that now that Jesus is gone? How can you be a disciple if there's no one to follow? I was talking with some clergy friends this week about the phenomenon of gurus and how in our society everyone is looking for a wise sage to follow. And apparently there's a funny movie about an Indian man in New York who went to India and learned about gurus and came back to impersonate one. And he kept saying, "I am not the guru, I am not the guru, I am not the guru." But the mantra was, "Sacred, sacred, who am I?" I haven't seen the movie, but it sounds really exciting. I think that this search for significance, this search for leadership, this search for meaning is not only prevalent in New York City among people who are chanting and attending yoga and looking for a guru. It's present right here in our own lives. If you'll think back over the last day, over the last week or month, over the last 8 months when our flood hit, there was a huge search for significance and blame and leadership. It's a natural course of things. Sometimes we have plans for our lives, but those aren't always God's plans. It's hard. It's hard to recognize God's plan in action. Someone asked me this week on a phone call, a complete stranger, what she should do about a situation in her personal life. I'd never met the woman before, and on the phone she said, "If you'll just tell me what to do, I'll do whatever you say." She was 74 years old. I thought, I'm half your age. I have so much less life experience than you do. But it was clear that she was searching. She was searching for something solid, something to hold on to. And so these guys are out in the boat, and their nets are empty, and they see a stranger on the beach. They don't recognize it as Jesus yet. And this guy shouts out, "Hey kids, you got any fish?" I mean, it's a little shocking. And I think that the disciples' response to do what he says, to cast the nets on the right-hand side of the boat, is probably an attempt to prove this guy wrong. I mean, they're professional fishermen. They know what they're doing, right? And they want to show this guy that he doesn't know what he's talking about. So they cast the nets as the guy instructs. And suddenly the nets are filled with fish. Now, I thought it was funny when I first read this, 153 fish. So you know me, I did a lot of research on the internet, Googled and Wikied and all the other things, and there's no real consensus about the number 153. You might have your own ideas, we can talk about it at coffee. But one thing I read was that an early Christian scholar said that at this time in history, the Greek zoologist had only identified 153 species of fish. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I thought it was an interesting explanation because if it's true, the point that John is trying to make as he tells this story is that not only were the fishermen, Peter and the other disciples, supposed to be fishing for men and women, they were supposed to be fishing for every single kind of person. Every single man and woman, every single faith, every single background, every single type out there. So I kind of like that explanation of 153. But this story is a little ironic. It has some things in it that might have given you a sense of deja vu. Like we've talked about these things before. For example, Peter seeing Jesus and jumping out into the water Do you remember when Peter first saw Jesus on a stormy night and said, "If you call to me, Lord, I'll come to you"? That's in Matthew 14:28. "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." At that point in time, when Peter started to walk out across the water, gazing into Jesus' eyes, he felt a moment of fear and he looked down and he began to sink. This time, when Peter sees Jesus, he doesn't hesitate. He doesn't look away. He pulls on his clothes and he jumps into the water and starts running ashore. Running because they're only 100 feet out, so it's actually not that far. He could have stayed in the boat. But I love Peter's energy, his excitement. He sees that Jesus is there, he knows something's going on, and he wants to be part of it. I wish sometimes that we had that same excitement when we see the plans that Jesus has. I wish that we too would get on board, jump out there, and run after God and God's plans. When he gets to the beach, Peter finds Jesus with a charcoal fire. An interesting detail. I would assume most beach fires are driftwood, but Jesus had obviously brought charcoal along. He had made plans for this meeting on the beach. He had prepared a space so that a relationship could happen. And the last time that we read about Peter standing by a fire was right after Jesus was arrested. John 18:18 says, "Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them, and he warmed himself." And if you'll remember, this was the third time that Peter denied knowing Jesus, just before the cock crowed. It's interesting that now on the beach with Jesus, there's another charcoal fire, another fire to repair the damaged relationship. This is the third time that Jesus appears to the disciples. And even as he's saying to them, "Come and have breakfast," he's meeting their physical needs. He's also teaching them, though, how to fish better. He meets their needs and he teaches them how to meet their own needs. This is a model that we've talked about a lot lately through our own church's ministry in the Lyons Emergency Assistance Fund. How can we support our community after the flood? How can we meet their needs? And how can we come alongside them and teach them and help them to meet their own needs? It's a challenging question. This visit from Jesus is all about relationships. Jesus isn't codependent, and he doesn't want us to be. Jesus doesn't need our worship or our participation in church community, but he offers those things to us as a blessing, as a way to know him, to know God, and to know ourselves and one another in community. Jesus also doesn't want us to be totally independent, striking out on our own without him. It's less productive that way, fishing all night, coming up with empty nets. We can work all night and still come home empty. Emptiness. It's better if we join Christ where he is, in an interdependent relationship. We could show up just as the disciples showed up in Galilee, and then we can let go. Let go of our own ideas about what we have to do and what we need to do and what we're able to do, and just listen. Just listen to God's plans. Were the disciples ready? Jesus stands ahead of them on the seashore, just as he stands in front of us on a dusty mountain road. And he invites us today to come and be fed. And then he challenges us to feed others, to get busy. Our community is waiting for our touch, our hope. Are we ready to get to work?